to get started, we're talking about the future of work. Like, what does the future have hold for us, and what can we do to adapt for ourselves, for our companies, and for the next generation? So this little session, this cafe chat, is about the future of masculinity in the workplace, and what does that have, what is going to happen in the future. So I really am so excited for this conversation, and my first question really is that, how has traditional masculinity in the workplace evolved over time?
Well, I can't speak from experience because I wasn't there when it started, but from the reading of history and whatnot, we know that we were cave people at one point in time, and there was roles in those small communities. And from the historians' best understanding, oftentimes the men were the hunters, and the women were the gatherers and the caregivers. Honestly, in that sense, when men were the hunters, oftentimes they came home empty-handed. And so actually in response to the caloric needs of those communities, it was the gatherers and the women who were actually the steadier source of income in that sense. And I think the big shift over time was the agrarian revolution, where humans kind of harnessed the power of agriculture, and men, because of physical stature and those kinds of things, took on more roles in tending to the crops and those kinds of things, and there was a value differential there in that sense. And flash forward to today. Right, work has evolved where we're not using our physical capabilities, and we're using our minds. And from all of the studies that we see in and around gender, specifically around the brain, and Lisa definitely is more of an expert in this field than I am, but we are incredibly statistically similar. So those types of processes where we're sitting in front of a computer and we're innovating, we're creative, we're having human relationships and whatnot, there isn't really a lot of gender difference.
Think of the future of work. Like, often our minds go to like AI, like our evolving relationship with technology, automation. How is this going to affect gender roles or masculinity in the workplace?
The number one job that male identified individuals have in Canada is truck driver. And once we have autonomous trucks, that is a whole swath of people without jobs. And there's a lot of whistleblowing and flag raising and whatnot, where exactly those jobs aren't lost. There will be new jobs created out of it in terms of maintenance of that technology and manufacturing and those kinds of things. So there's a transformation, but there will be an attrition and a jarring transition point, because what was known and taken for granted for a period of time is no longer. And when I think about that, we're in the early stages of automation and AI, and the early stages are decimating women's jobs, predominantly in, let's say, retail. So we're seeing a lot of self-checkouts come out and those kinds of things. But that second wave will really go after a lot of that manufacturing where it's kind of male dominated and whatnot.
So from a AI automation, like oversimplifying, the context that we're getting into, but is there an idea that this would level the playing field in some ways? Because if we're truly relying on creativity, innovation, like our brain work and how it then interacts with technology, that really takes the physical component out of it. So do you think that it'll have a positive effect on?
In a utopian world, it could. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. However, modern day, women have been fighting, rightly so, for equality for a really long time. But the modern day understanding of feminism was really birthed after World War II. Where the men went away to war and the women took on the roles in the factories. And then when the men came back, the women got pushed out and had the knowledge that, hey, we can do this work too. We can be providers and whatnot. And so over the last 70 plus years, we've had a really brilliant conversation about women's roles and identities in society. And we've made huge leaps in women's representation in science, technology, engineering, math, leadership, politics, all of these traditionally male dominated verticals. However, we've been missing a parallel conversation for, with, and about men. Actually, for and with men, because we've been talking a lot about men, but not necessarily for and with them. But we haven't created new possibilities for men. And there's a building tension and a building friction in that sense, because patriarchy still dictates that men's value to society and to their families is as a protector and as a provider. And so if those roles don't exist anymore necessarily in the traditional sense, what are we encouraging them to be? So if we've removed that manual labor and earning that income and leveled the playing field in and around that, who is giving them new possibilities to be more engaged with their children and to potentially move into early childhood education or caregiving as we have an aging population, and normalizing that, you know, men can and should be in those spaces that are traditionally female dominated as well.
Of course. And then we don't, like, to your point, we have all this, you know, formal structure to raise women up in different, and I mean, we still have a long way to go, but it's there, and there's groups, and then it's not seen in the same way from a men's perspective. And one of the things I do is I work with cancer patients. And when it comes to things like support groups or rallying around everything from a sport or what have you, it's women. Men deal with illness still very much in isolation. Why do you think that is, and what can we do about it?
A lot of the work that Next Gen Men does is really in and around the parsing out that, yes, en masse, men do benefit from patriarchy, but patriarchy also harms individual men. And those individual men each add up to the mass, right? And so, you know, men are 3 out of 4 suicides. Men die on average 5 years earlier than women due to increased risk-taking and lack of health-seeking behaviors. Men experience increased rates of substance abuse, homelessness, incarceration, right? Those are all gender-based issues that affect men. Men can't reach out for help. They don't know where to begin. So we need this +1 network. And there's traditional masculine norms and identities wrapped up in that. And so if we're to really move towards equality, how do we start looking at those things?
Why should, let's say, a male corporate leader give a damn about this? So if patriarchy is serving them, has served them, yeah, is part of the reason they are where they are, although admitting that is even a leap. Why should they care about this?
That's really where we're trying to come with our work in these spaces, is answering that fundamental human question of what's in it for me. Men start to care about patriarchy and gender-based issues because they've had what we call sensitizing experiences. What that often looks like is mental health issues, job loss, divorce, identity issues. I talked about the suicide statistic earlier. The 2 main risk groups are late teens into early 20s, and then mid-50s into mid-60s. And that mid-50s, mid-60s is because they're retiring, because they're obsolete, because they're not innovative. And they've built up their entire identity as this contributor and provider, and it's a tremendous shock to them. And they don't know where else to go. What value do I have to the society anymore, right? And so, you know, when we can paint that picture and put the risk there, if you're, you know, a 30-something-year-old guy who your sensitizing experience is, I have this new child and I want them to grow up okay. If it's a daughter, I don't want her to, you know, face discrimination or sexual harassment. If it's a boy, I don't want him to be harmed by, you know, boys will be boys and the things that I experience. So I'm starting to think about this critically. How do we paint a path forward for them?
Right. So how do we?
We get them engaged with Next Gen Men, obviously. But I think a lot of it is normalizing and role modeling, right? Like, yeah, the people who sit in institutional places of power, great if you say, you know, flex work and paternity leave and these kinds of things. But if you're just talking the talk and you're not walking the walk, right? Like if you're not, you know, chiming in on your company Slack and saying, hey folks, I'm taking a mental health day today. Hope you're all doing well. Right. And if I see the VP who's, you know, trying to get onto that CEO track, taking paternity leave, right, and killing their career, you know, I know it's okay for me to also be an engaged parent moving forward. And, you know, we're trying to do a little bit of jujitsu. We're trying to use, you know, these traditional masculine norms. And we're saying, do you have the courage to be vulnerable? Are you strong enough to, you know, say that you don't know and that you need help, right? And flip that on them.
So do you think that that's a key to the future of work and getting some gender equity is paternity leave?
The fact of the matter is we all have unconscious biases, period. So if you are a hiring individual, it's really hard for you to overcome that this individual is of a childbearing age and, you know, they might have a family. But if we mitigate that bias by saying everyone is taking paternity leave 6 months, it doesn't matter. The benefit to the man himself, one, gains empathy for their partner in that experience, and I'm obviously speaking in heteronormative terms, right? But the birthing parent, they're there with them, they're helping them out, they're helping them heal from the experience of giving birth that they didn't have to do. And then two, they're gaining competence and intimacy with that child from a very young age. Because if you know, take the 1 or 2 day parental leave, I just had a baby, and then you go back to work, you're going to come home to a really tired partner who hands you a baby and says, do this, this, and that. You're doing it, but it's not intuitive. It's because it's a to-do and it's a task list. You don't actually know what your child needs, and you don't have that understanding of that relationship.
I have such a great memory. I went to the south of France with my husband when my son was 1, and my son was 1, so he was quite large. So my husband always had him in the carrier on his front. And every time he met another dad, they had this like dad nod. Like it was like a club that you could kind of see forming, which was great. And then when we went back, we went to quite a few different Scandinavian countries. And again, my husband was often carrying our daughter. My point was I carried her for 9 months. You have the next 18 years. I think that's fair. And so the same thing happened that I don't see in North America for sure. Like that's one, it's more rare to see fathers carrying them. Not completely rare, but more rare. And there was a normalcy around fathers taking care of young children that I thought was absolutely fascinating, and that you saw it everywhere. And even the older generations would come and talk to Lou about his experience of being a father, which has never happened in North America. But how as a society can we start changing and molding some of these things? And then how from our individual companies, wherever we sit in them, can we start making a change?
There's 3 levels of change. There's individual, there's community and organizational, and then there's systemic. And it's kind of, you know, you can't really build on one another. It happens in the different ways, but many people stop short of that systemic, especially male identifying individuals, because we benefit from the status quo of the system, right? So as we move through that journey, as we're, you know, learning and unlearning our own personal issues, and I say unlearning, and that is one of the most vulnerable, difficult things to do, because unlearning involves admitting that things that you believe to be true and valid are wrong, and replacing those with new beliefs, right? And so that is a lot of deep individual work. And then as we grow out of that, okay, how do I engage my community or my organization and create change in that? And then the systemic work comes when these and organizations start organizing and shifting those systems.
And with that, let's open it up to some questions. I see some popping up there that are fantastic.
Is how do we remove that stigma? One, we have role models with social capital show us that it's okay. And if we don't have the role models, then we mandate that everyone has to do it, because that removes the stigma right away too, right? I think the important thing to note through that is our systemic programming is so deep. It's difficult for us to overcome without other people helping us. So as a position of power, like it sounds like there's a bit of power in that, right? It's up to you to carve out that space. So rather than saying, are you taking parental leave? You say, how much parental leave are you taking? Mm-hmm. Because then you are creating the expectation that they are taking time, right? And so when we have that social capital, how do we leverage it to create that space for others and not put the burden on them to overcome that themselves?
The question is, how do non-binary gender identifying people fit into this conversation, which I think is a really important question.
Totally. I think going back to what I said earlier about our brains really trying to live in binaries, yes, no, black, white, male, female, like we have so much social conditioning in and around that. And it's difficult for me, for a practitioner, to lead in this space because I don't want to erase those narratives. But society is so strongly within that. I mean, like 98% falls within that gender binary. And so how do we have that conversation? But what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to move towards, masculinity and femininity are measuring sticks. If we use those measuring sticks, so if we say, you know, for women to be qualified leaders, they need to tap into their masculine energy, or however the hell we want to say that. As you can tell, I'm not very woo-woo in that sense. But, you know, to lead, women will always fall short because men have that more naturally perceived. Where on the flip side, if we say men need to get in touch with their divine feminine so that they can emote or be caregivers, then they will inevitably always fall short because women fall into that more naturally. And so in between that, you know, if there's people who just say, I don't ascribe to any of those measuring sticks, they're actually leading us, right? I've learned so much from trans and non-binary individuals about the performance of masculinity and femininity, right? Like a quick example that I use, there's a trans man who taught me, and I could cerebrally understand this around how masculinity is a performance, but until they showed me that they had to relearn how to check their fingernails so that they could present male, that's when it clicked for me. So women will often check their fingernails like this, and men will check their fingernails like this, right? And so there's all of these little things where when people are absolutely bucking those binaries, they're leading the way for us to succeed in a world without those gender norms. I think, you know, picking up on what Lisa was saying around in this post-COVID world where, you know, there is a lot of unemployment and a choice of talent, as employers, there needs to be consequences when, you know, someone does take parental leave and they lose their job because of it, right? So, you know, what are those nudges that you know, policymakers can move towards for us as well? You know, mandating around equal pay for equal work, closing the wage gap, and I think, yeah, again, a lot of this work, if it's really difficult for us because we're adults, we've been socialized in this world. We're on our journeys of unlearning right now. So what can we do with youth? What can we do with the next generation? How can we make it? And you know, I look at the next generation. We work with 12 to 14-year-old boys. You know, they know what feminism is. They know what trans individuals are. I went to a Catholic school. There was, you know, nobody was quote unquote out in my school. I didn't know what feminism was. They're leaps and bounds ahead of us. So how do we keep giving them permission to lead? And even in countries that are quote unquote leading, such as let's say Denmark, which maybe Lisa will touch on, but as men are taking parental leave in those spaces, in Denmark, in certain, the cultural norm is men are baking apology cakes to their colleagues saying, sorry, I'm missing out, I'm taking parental leave, because it's mandated, right? And so, you know, there's this push-pull of like legislation and culture. And so how are we navigating all that? And it took us, you know, as I said, from, you know, cavemen to agrarian revolution to today, it took us a really long time to get where we are. It's going to take us a little while to renegotiate and transform this, but we're doing this work now. And with that, I'll pass it to Lisa.
Yeah, and the research that I was doing when I was traveling around was more about how we recover from stress and work, and then it just showed these gender biases and I'll say general awfulness that comes to exactly that because of emotional labor and taking on more things as females. But seeing some rules and regulations, legislation around paternity leave in Europe was both good and bad. So one of the conversations I had was a CEO of a company, female, feminist, and she was so frustrated because women in Finland are allowed to take 3 years in the first 7 years of their child's life. And how do you hire somebody, and how do you then constantly get somebody to fill that spot? And she said, like, hiring a young female will cost me so much more money than hiring a young man. How is there not going to be discrimination on that front? So as much as it seems like a pro-feminist idea, the reality is that it's not articulating quite the same. But then you're also in a country that I was, first time as we flew into the country, my husband looked at me and goes, "Your people are in charge here." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And she is my age, the prime minister there. So I was like, huh, your people have been in charge for a long time in a lot of places. Like, that was the conversation we had. And so it is interesting because from a role modeling perspective, what are we going to see? We've had the first like female prime minister in New Zealand have a baby while she's in office, and that her partner, stayed home on pat leave because she was, I don't know, leading a country. So we are going to see some shifts. I think it's just going to take a long time because we've been so constantly, this agenda has been pushed, the status quo, that people are benefiting, the decision makers are constantly benefiting from the status quo, so it becomes this cyclical thing. So it's really exciting. I'm interested, people from all over the world are listening to this conversation on how this plays out over the next little while and how it influences the future of work and what that means. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you, Jake, for having this discussion with us.
You know, I could talk about this for hours.